In the top stories, safe harbor to be granted to Royal Cruise Line vessels, COVID spike in Trinidad and Tobago leads to the closure of many businesses, and Japan records its worst economic contraction. Hello and welcome to the ZIZ Midday Newscast. Today is Monday, the 17th of August, 2020. I'm Jason Davis. Nationally, St. Kitts and Nevis will provide safe harbor to 2 Royal Caribbean Cruise Line cruise ships beginning on Wednesday, August 19. Minister of Tourism, the Honorable Lindsay Grant, informed the public of this at a press conference at the Customs Conference Room on Monday. He said the cruise ships Vision of the Seas and Rhapsody of the Seas will dock with 70 crew members each on board.
The Royal Caribbean Cruise Lines, which is one of our largest cruise line partners, has reached out to the government of St. Kitts and Nevis for safe harboring for 2 of their vessels, the Vision of the Seas and the Rhapsody of the Seas at Port Zante. The safe harboring really allows the vessels to dock side by side at Port Zante, and both cruise ships must adhere to all the necessary health protocols and all the laws and the regulations of St. Kitts and Nevis, including and not limited to the SRNOs which issued under the state of emergency.
Minister Grant said all health and safety measures will be taken to ensure citizens and residents are not exposed to COVID-19. He further outlined the protocols that have been put in place that must be followed by the cruise line and its crew members.
Upon arrival on Wednesday, each crew member will be given a PCR molecular test and will be quarantined for the 14 days on board their respective vessel. At the end of the 14-day quarantine, they will be given a second test. Once the crew receive a negative test, they will be given the option to integrate into our society, adhering to the well-known safety measures of social distancing, hand sanitization, and the wearing of masks.
He noted that if any crew member tests positive for COVID-19, all crew members will remain on board and go through quarantine until all 70 members test negative. The tourism minister also spoke of the advantages of allowing the cruise ships to dock at Port Zante.
St. Kitts and Nevis's businesses will benefit from the crew being here in the Federation when approved to integrate into our society. They will use our supermarkets, our restaurants, our bars, taxis, port fees for SCASPA, barber shops, hair salons, the market, and many other businesses. The government will gain revenue for the supply of water and the disposal of dry and wet waste by the Solid Waste Management Corporation. Crew members will seek to learn more about our island by taking tours and excursions. They are indeed welcome to explore the island.
It was noted that the 2 ships will be docked for 1 month in the first instance, with the possibility for an extension. Prime Minister Dr. the Honorable Timothy Harris says his government intends to use the planned reopening of schools in early September as a measuring stick as to how well St. Kitts and Nevis is prepared to handle the inflow of visitors to its shores when the borders reopen in October. Permanent Secretary in the Ministry of Education, William Hodge, revealed that schools are expected to reopen on Monday, September 7, with a virtual opening ceremony. September 7 and 8 are reserved for teachers to convene their various meetings in schools. Then, on Wednesday, September 9, students will return to classes. On the most recent edition of the Leadership Matters program, Prime Minister Harris stated, quote, "Our organization and reopening of the education sector for me is a big test of our systems, a big test of our ability to deal with large crowds, because we're talking about 12,000 plus persons participating in educational settings. If we can do this successfully, then I believe believe we would have reached a substantial way in our ability to treat and to deal with tourists who will come when we finally reopen up all sectors of our economy." End quote. The Prime Minister said he's comforted by the fact that here in St. Kitts and Nevis there are competent individuals to lead the charge in the safe reopening of schools. In other news, in support of the Anti-Proliferation Financing of Weapons of Mass Destruction Bill, Minister of Foreign Affairs, the Honourable Mark Brantley, stated that the legislation is another manifestation of the nation's efforts to be a responsible member of the international community. Minister Brantley said that St. Kitts and Nevis made headlines around the world because of its agreement to ratify the nuclear ban treaty. He noted that this move, like the legislation which was put before Cabinet, was an example of the Federation being a responsible member of the international community.
Not only did we agree that we would ratify this treaty, but we agreed that we would ratify it, and we did so on August 9th, 2020. August 9th, 2020 was the 75th anniversary to the day of the bombing of Nagasaki. We would recall, certainly for me, from our history books, from others, perhaps they were alive at that time. But the United States, the Allies, would have dropped 2 bombs. One on Hiroshima on the 6th of August, 1945. The second on Nagasaki 3 days later on the 9th of August, 1945. And 75 years on, St. Kitts and Nevis joined with some other 44 nations who had hitherto ratified this convention to ratify the convention to ban nuclear weapons.
The Foreign Affairs Minister said that this was significant because of the symbolism that, quote, as a small nation in the Caribbean Sea and far removed from Japan, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, we had used the occasion of the 75th anniversary of the bombing of Nagasaki to ratify this particular treaty, end quote.
Our position has been clear, that we see no useful purpose for nuclear armaments in today's world. Nuclear weapons are, as the name suggests, weapons. They are weapons of mass destruction. And to put it in context, the bombing of Hiroshima on the 6th of August 1945 would have led to the deaths of some 90 to 146,000 people. The bombing of Nagasaki would have led to the deaths of some 39,000 to 80,000 people.
Minister Brantley stated that the 2 events triggered an alarming new development in the world. That is, nuclear weapons can destroy entire civilizations and has led to an arms race with major powers around the world. St. Kitts and Nevis was the 8th member of CARICOM to ratify the treaty, following Guyana, St. Lucia, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, Trinidad and Tobago, Dominica, Antigua and Barbuda, and Belize. Moving now to news on the regional scene. Prime Minister Dr. Keith Rowley has announced that due to the rampant spread of COVID-19 in Trinidad and Tobago, a slew of closures has been implemented as of August 17. These measures are expected to remain in place for at least 28 days. In a press conference, the PM announced the closure of gyms, houses of worship, casinos and members clubs. Access to beaches and rivers will be suspended once again. The Prime Minister also revealed that the government is looking at institutional laws to make mask wearing mandatory. Dr. Rowley appealed to the public to be responsible in the face of the COVID-19 crisis. He called for unity and understanding in the face of the new measures. Still on the regional scene, opposition leader of the Bahamas, Philip Davis, has tested positive for COVID-19. In a message sent from his hospital bed, the political leader of the Progressive Liberal Party said in the last 6 weeks, over 1,000 Bahamians tested positive for the coronavirus, and on Sunday, he suffered a similar fate. The opposition leader is the first parliamentarian in the Bahamas to test positive for COVID-19. On Saturday, a record-breaking 133 new cases were recorded. Late on Sunday, the Ministry of Health issued a report which said another 63 cases were recorded, bringing the total number of confirmed cases to 1,315. The Ministry of Health also reported on Sunday that another suspected COVID-19 related death. According to the ministry, quote, investigations are being conducted into the death of this unfortunate individual, and the death toll now stands at 18, end quote. Internationally, Japan has recorded its worst economic contraction in modern history, mainly because of the coronavirus. The world's third largest economy shrank by an annualized 27.8% in the second quarter from April to June. Al Jazeera's Rob McBride reports from Seoul, South Korea.
The scale of Japan's contraction is worse than even the most pessimistic forecasts. It would translate into an annualized decline of more than 27% for an economy that was already in recession.
It took a big hit in the last quarter of 2019, and then the coronavirus effect began to come in 2020, so the Japanese economy is in a world of hurt.
Exports like cars have fallen by more than a quarter on a year ago, while inbound tourists have virtually disappeared. It's a personal setback for Japan's Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, who has made the economy one of his priorities, and who'll be hoping the only way for the economy to go now is up.
We will continue to make the utmost effort to put the economy on the growth path after it bottomed out in April and May.
Abe has been widely criticized for his handling of the pandemic.
And Abe failed to provide any leadership. He did not establish early on a control tower for policies dealing with containing COVID-19 outbreak in Japan.
Critics say he delayed an effective response to save the Tokyo Summer Olympics, which had to be postponed anyway at huge economic cost. And businesses have not adapted well to changed working practices.
When people had to move to teleworking and people had to move to more digital solutions, Japan was pretty unprepared for that compared to other advanced economies.
Japan's experience is in stark contrast to neighboring South Korea, which, of all the developed nations, is predicted to come out best from the pandemic with an economic contraction of less than 1% this year. Seoul has been widely applauded for an effective early response to the outbreak without shutting down major parts of the economy. It's also credited with being nimbler in adapting its economy for a world altered forever by the pandemic. Rob McBride, Al Jazeera, Seoul.
Colombia's economy has suffered its worst slump on record as businesses struggle during the coronavirus pandemic. Al Jazeera's Alessandro Rampietti reports from Bogota.
It's the end of the line for the Poise hair salon. Until recently a successful endeavor of hairdressers Andres and his partner, but almost 5 months of coronavirus restrictions and the lack of promised government assistance left them with no other option but to close its doors.
We were doing very well. I sold a car and a motorcycle to further invest in the shop. We built it with much effort and especially love. It's very sad to see your dreams come to an end.
Like many other countries, the pandemic has taken a heavy toll on Colombia, but it's hitting particularly hard in a country that had seen a steady economic growth for 2 decades and where more than 5 million people had risen from poverty to enter into the middle class.
We are facing the deepest and strongest recession that we have in the history of Colombia. With the data that we're getting basically on economic activity and the size of the closures end up having a toll in terms of unemployed, in terms of firms that are just closing down. This is something that has never happened in the country before.
Many shops that have reopened are struggling to get back into gear. In normal times, this mall would be teeming with people at this time of the day, but as you can see, there's barely anybody here, and more than 10% of its shop have already closed for good. Others are striving to keep the doors open, like Ivan Ospina. Raised in a low-income family, through hard work he was able to open a successful restaurant in an up-and-coming neighborhood of Bogota. With the pandemic, he has reduced his staff from 16 to 4 people and has been operating at a loss, hoping things will turn around soon, but he's pessimistic.
I fear the country will go back to the 80s, and we're seeing it already with the streets emptied out and colonized by the poor. It's showing us how fragile our new middle class really is. This pandemic arrived and it's destroying it. A lot of people are falling through the cracks.
The government has announced a series of measures to deal with the crisis, pumping billions into the country's central bank and promising debt relief and economic assistance. But for many, it has already been too little too late to keep the lights on. Alessandro Ampietti, Al Jazeera, Bogotá.
And now for the weather. Present weather is fair with a slight haze. Winds are east at 12 to 21 miles per hour with gusts up to 32 miles per hour. Seas are moderate with waves of 5 to 7 feet. A small craft advisory is still in place for the eastern side of the islands. Weather for today will be partly sunny with a slightly hazy with a 20% or slight chance of showers. Tonight will be partly cloudy and slightly hazy with a 30% or low chance of showers. Sunset today will be at 6:35 p.m. Sunrise tomorrow at 5:55 a.m. And that brings us to the end of the ZIZ Midday Newscast. Join us this evening for these stories and more in detail. Thank you for tuning in. I'm Jason Davis.